Welcome to a world where unimaginable wealth exists, not in our time, but in the medieval age. Settle into your favorite spot now. Go ahead and pull that blanket up a little higher, right up to your chin. Let your shoulders relax and feel the tension leave your neck. Allow your breathing to slow down. There is nothing else you need to do right now but rest and listen. Where are you tuning in from? Is it late evening? Or are you catching an early morning moment in your wonderfully complicated schedule? Whatever the hour, I hope your day has been kind. If these quiet journeys bring you comfort, consider following our little show so we never miss each other. Now, allow your mind to drift back with me, far back. Forget the quiet hum of modern life and the glow of your screen. Instead, you hear the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. From the high arched window of your stone manor, you watch merchants guiding their weary pack animals along the road below. They work for you. In this world, your fortune is vast, but your challenges have only just begun. In the great hall of his ancestral keep, Lord Alaric felt the cool morning seep from the thick stone walls, a welcome relief from the summer's insistence. The rushes on the floor, though changed only a week prior, already smelled of dried herbs and spilled wine. His steward, a man whose face was a map of worried lines, unrolled a long sheet of parchment across the oak table. The scratching of his finger on the dried sheepskin was a familiar sound, the true music of Alaric's power. It was not the call of a war horn or the cheer of a crowd, but the quiet, relentless tally of his domain's lifeblood. The steward began to read in a low monotone, a litany of numbers that represented fields, forests, and futures. The north fields yielded 200 bushels of wheat per hide of land, my lord. A good season, the steward announced, his finger tracing a line of neat ink. The sheep count in the high pastures is over 3,000 now, and the wool clip was heavy, he continued, listing measures of timber from the eastern woods, barrels of salted fish from the river weirs, and sacks of barley destined for the alehouses. For a simple midday meal, a dozen servants would soon be moving through the kitchens below, but this scroll represented the work of thousands, the tenants who tilled his soil, the shepherds who guarded his flocks, the foresters who marked his trees. It was a wealth as solid and deep as the earth itself, measured in seasons and generations. The steward paused, clearing his throat, a subtle signal of unwelcome news. There is one matter, my lord. Lord Valerius has enclosed the old common lands bordering our western pastures. He is putting more sheep to graze. Alaric felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Valerius was an ambitious neighbor, and more sheep meant more wool. More wool meant a lower price at the regional market, a direct challenge not to his survival, but to his dominance. The weight of his fortune was not just in its size, but in its supremacy over others. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. This was a silent declaration of war, to be fought not with swords, but with shepherds and merchants in a dusty market town. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the south, in a city where fortunes were made and lost between one tide and the next, Niccolo di Vieri stood on a crowded dock. He pulled his fine woolen cloak tighter against the damp wind coming off the sea, a breeze that carried the sharp tang of salt, tar, and rotting fish that made his eyes water. The cries of gulls overhead mixed with the shouts of sailors in a dozen different tongues, a harsh mix of sounds that was, to him, the sound of opportunity. Before him, his heavy-bellied cog, a round-hulled trading ship, was being unloaded. Dock workers swarmed its decks, their backs straining as they hoisted crates onto the pier. Niccolo's gaze was fixed on a set of smaller, heavily bound chests being handled with special care. One of these chests was pried open for his inspection. The moment the lid lifted, a potent wave of scent, cinnamon, clove, and something peppery and sharp rushed out, making him sneeze. He dipped a finger into the mountain of black peppercorns, the tiny hard spheres representing a journey of thousands of miles, across deserts and oceans, through storms and the hands of countless middlemen. In his nearby counting house, a dozen clerks sat hunched over their desks, the constant scratching of their quills filling the room as they turned these spices into figures on a ledger. Niccolo's wealth was not in the soil. It was fluid, a river of coin and credit that flowed through his hands, powerful but perilous. As he turned to leave the dock, he passed a waterfront tavern from which the sounds of rough laughter and music spilled. Through the open doorway, he saw two rival merchants, their heads close together, their expressions serious. He caught only a few words carried on the wind. Pool our ships, Genoese prices, and pepper. A cold knot formed in his stomach. They were planning to join forces, to bring in a larger shipment than he could manage alone, and sell it for less, flooding the market. His rivals understood, as he did, that this world of trade was a battle every bit as fierce as Alaric's contests of land and wool, just fought with numbers and nerve instead of knights. In another quarter of that same city, away from the chaos of the port, the air moved to a different rhythm. Here, the defining sound was the steady, hypnotic clatter of looms from the workshop of Ilara, a master weaver. The noise echoed from the timbered walls of her large workspace, a sound so constant that she only noticed it when it stopped. Her hands, elegant and strong, were stained at the fingertips with hints of blue and deep rose, the marks of her trade. She was inspecting a length of silk shimmering on a loom, its color a breathtaking shade of twilight purple, a hue no other workshop in the city had managed to replicate. This secret, locked away in her knowledge of roots, insects, and minerals, was the foundation of her considerable fortune. Her workshop was a hive of quiet, focused activity. In one corner, two young apprentices, their faces smudged with dust, used a heavy stone to grind lapis lazuli into a fine, brilliant blue powder. The effort made their shoulders ache and their breathing heavy, but the precious pigment they produced was worth more than its weight in gold. Other workers carded raw silk, their motions swift and practiced, while weavers guided their shuttles back and forth, the intricate patterns growing thread by thread. Ilara's wealth was not in land or in ships, but in the skill of her own two hands, and the closely guarded knowledge she passed down to her most trusted workers. This quiet prosperity, however, had not gone unnoticed. That afternoon, she received a visit from a senior official of the Weavers' Guild, a man with a soft voice and eyes that missed nothing. He praised the quality of her work, admiring the purple silk with a little too much enthusiasm. "Such success is a credit to our guild, Master Alara," he said, smiling. "But one must be careful. Expanding too quickly, taking on too many apprentices, it can breed jealousy. It is always wise to remember one's place for the good of all." The words were a silken glove, but the message within was hard as iron. She was becoming too successful, too powerful. The guild that was meant to protect her would just as easily crush her if she threatened the established order. As the guild official departed, Alara felt a chill, though the vats of hot dye nearby warmed the workshop. She looked at the faces of her apprentices who depended on her for their livelihood, and then at the shimmering silk, the source of her fame and her new vulnerability. She understood the warning perfectly. Her secret process was her greatest asset, but in a city built on connections and rivalries, it also made her a target for those who either wished to steal it or stamp it out. The jealousy of other weavers was a more immediate threat than any foreign army. For Alaric on his estate, Niccolo on his dock, and Ilara in her workshop, the day's worries were vastly different, yet born of the same source. Their great wealth, whether rooted in the soil, carried on the sea, or woven from a single thread, was not a peaceful harbor, but a battlefield. It demanded constant vigilance, a sharp mind, and a willingness to fight for what they had built. Each of them, in their own world, felt the immense weight of what they possessed, and the gnawing fear that it could all be taken away. Across Alaric's lands, the evening bells of the local chapels began to ring, calling the tenants from the fields. At the port, the dock workers shouted their last goodbyes as they headed for the taverns. And in Ilara's workshop, the steady clatter of the looms finally fell silent, one by one, replaced by the quiet sweeping of the floors. Throughout their domains, the familiar rhythms of life and labor settled in for the night. The foundation of Alaric's power was not the gold in his chests, but the earth under his boots and the people who worked it. This truth was most clear on court days, when the great hall transformed from a place of feasting to a chamber of judgment. The long tables were pushed against the walls, creating an open space before his heavy, carved chair set upon a low platform. Tenants shuffled in, their boots tracking in the scents of damp soil and livestock, their faces etched with the worries of the season. They stood with their caps in their hands, their eyes cast down, waiting for his word, which was as final as the changing of the seasons. The air, cool from the thick stone, carried their murmurs and coughs up to the high shadowed rafters, where the family banners hung limp and still. He listened first to a dispute between two men, their faces flushed with anger. One, a farmer named Thomas, claimed his neighbor, Will, had moved a boundary stone in the night, stealing a hand's breadth of his best pasture. Will swore he had not, that the stone had been shifted by the winter floods. Alaric listened patiently, his fingers steepled before him, his gaze moving from one man to the other. He asked not for oaths, but for details. Where was the old willow stump in relation to the stone? Which way did the runoff from the hill flow? It was a tedious process, a careful untangling of knots tied by greed or simple misunderstanding. Ultimately, he declared the stone would be reset by his own steward, a decision that satisfied neither man completely, but ended the argument, which was the true purpose of his judgment. Following this, a younger man, his face pale with worry, stepped forward to petition for repairs to his cottage roof. He spoke of the coming autumn rains and the leak that dripped directly onto the cot where his children slept. As Alaric considered the cost of the timber and the labor, his youngest son, Geoffrey, who sat on a smaller stool to his right, shifted impatiently. The boy, barely a man, let out a quiet sigh of boredom. Alaric caught the sound and glanced at him. Geoffrey leaned closer, his voice a low whisper meant only for his father's ear. "Why do you listen to this endless droning? They are like cattle. Give them their grass and their shelter and have done with it. Their little squabbles are beneath you." The words struck Alaric with the force of a physical blow. He kept his face a mask of calm, but a cold knot formed in his gut. After dismissing the petitioner with a promise that the steward would see to the roof, he turned his full attention to his son. "Never," Alaric said, his voice so low it was almost a hiss. "Let me hear you speak that way again. These people are not cattle. They are the posts that hold up this roof. They are the arms that swing the scythe, the hands that grind the flour. Without them, this hall is just a pile of cold stones, and we are just men with old names and empty bellies. Your disdain is a luxury we cannot afford." Geoffrey recoiled, his face coloring with shame. But Alaric wondered if the boy understood the lesson was not one of kindness, but of cold, hard necessity. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in a bustling port city, Niccolo di Vieri's power rested on something far less tangible than land. His domain was a network of promises, contracts, and calculations that stretched across the known sea. His great hall was a warehouse, filled not with tenants, but with barrels of wine, sacks of pepper, and bolts of silk. The air did not smell of the earth, but of salt, tarred rope, and the faint, enticing aroma of spices from lands he would never see. Here, disputes were not settled by a lord's judgment, but by the careful weighing of figures in a ledger and the shrewd assessment of a man's worth. His most trusted ship captain, a weathered man named Matteo, with eyes the color of the sea in a storm, stood before him in his counting house. The room was small, dominated by a large table covered in maps and shipping schedules. Matteo had just returned from Alexandria, his ship heavy with alum, a substance vital for fixing dyes in cloth and spices that would fetch a fortune in the northern markets. He detailed the voyage, speaking of storms dodged and port fees cleverly negotiated in 3 different languages. It was the kind of report that should have brought Niccolo immense satisfaction, a testament to his well-run enterprise. However, Matteo's report ended with a complication. "There is the matter of a sailor, a Genoese man named Lorenzo," Matteo began, his brow furrowed. "He is the best topman I have ever seen. In the squall off Crete, he climbed the mast when no other man dared, securing a sail that would have torn away and left us crippled. He saved us days, perhaps the ship itself." Niccolo nodded, already anticipating the problem. "He has asked for a larger share of the profit, not his wage, which was paid, but a portion of the final sale. He says his skill is worth more than the standard rate for a common sailor." This was a more difficult puzzle than a shifted boundary stone. Niccolo leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in the quiet room. He valued skill and daring. It was the lifeblood of his business. Lorenzo was an asset, a tool more valuable than any rope or canvas. To lose him to a rival merchant over a few florins would be poor business. On the other hand, his crews numbered in the hundreds. If word spread that a single sailor could negotiate his own terms, every man from the lowest deckhand to the highest-ranking officer would be at his door. The carefully balanced structure of wages and shares that made his ventures profitable would crumble. "The other men, they watched him ask?" Niccolo inquired, his voice even. "They know of his demand?" Matteo nodded grimly. "They know. Some think him bold, others greedy, but all of them are waiting to see what you will do. They see his courage and wonder what their own is worth." Niccolo was caught. Rewarding Lorenzo might secure the loyalty of one exceptional man, but would plant the seeds of dissent among 100 others. Refusing him would maintain order, but could cost him the very man who might save his next cargo from the sea's fury. It was a problem of pure calculation, a balancing of present value against future risk. He stared at the figures scratched onto a piece of parchment, the cost of the alum, the projected price of the pepper, the wages for the crew. Alaric's tenants were bound to him by birth and tradition, an unbroken chain of obligation stretching back for generations. Niccolo's men were bound only by coin and contract. They came from a dozen different ports, spoke a handful of different tongues, and prayed to God in their own ways. Their loyalty was not inherited. It had to be bought and rebought with every voyage. This was the essential difference in their worlds. One was a rigid structure of stone, the other a fluid network of ships constantly in motion. Alaric, in his hall, sought to preserve a static order, a world where every man knew his place. His power was in continuity. Niccolo, in his counting house, had to manage constant change, a world where a man's place was determined by his skill and his nerve. He made his decision. "Pay him," Niccolo said quietly. "Pay him a bonus in silver, separate from his share. Call it a gift for exceptional service, a reward for saving the ship. Record it as such in the ship's log." He would not change the contract, for that was sacred. But a gift set no precedent. It was a personal gesture, a master's recognition of a servant's great deed. It was a solution that preserved the structure while acknowledging the man, a delicate maneuver in a world where a single misstep could undo a fortune. The echoes in Alaric's great hall carried the weight of centuries of duty and deference. In Niccolò's warehouse, the creak of the timbers and the distant shouts from the docks spoke of a newer, more restless kind of power. Both men, in their own way, spent their days managing the delicate web of human relationships that held their vast wealth together. For one, it was a matter of enforcing ancient obligations. For the other, it was a constant negotiation of worth. The lingering scent of wood smoke in the nobleman's hall and the sharp tang of salt in the merchant's office were the invisible marks of their very different gilded cages. The familiar comfort of his counting house, with its neat stacks of ledgers and the faint scent of ink and vellum, was a distant memory. Here, on the salt road, comfort was a fleeting thing. Niccolò di Vieri felt the rhythm of his horse, a steady, swaying motion that had become the background to his every thought. Beneath him, the thick leather of the saddle creaked in time with the groaning of the heavy wagon axles behind them. Each turn of the wheels was a victory against the mud, a thick, greedy clay that sucked at the hooves and spokes, demanding effort for every foot of progress. He pulled the collar of his woolen cloak tighter, not against a chill, but against the persistent dampness that seemed to work its way into a man's bones. This slow, arduous pace made them a tempting target, a fact that settled like a cold stone in Niccolò's dut. The guards he had hired, 20 men armed with crossbows and short swords, were worth every silver coin he'd paid them. They walked with a tense alertness, their eyes constantly scanning the dense, dripping forests that pressed in on either side of the road. At night, their whispers around the cook fire were the only sound besides the hoot of an owl or the sudden rustle of some unseen creature in the undergrowth. One of the guards, a man named Leo with a scar that split his eyebrow, insisted that the cry of a nightjar foretold trouble, and Niccolò found himself listening for the sound with a dread that shamed his practical mind. Their progress brought them, after a week of toil, to a makeshift border crossing marked by a heavy wooden boom lowered across the road. A tower, more of a stone shed perched on a mound of earth, stood beside it, flying a banner Niccolò did not recognize, the personal standard of some local lordling asserting his authority over this patch of miserable road. A man in a stained leather jerkin and a rusty helmet emerged, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword with a practiced casualness. He had the look of a man who knew his position was his only real power, and he intended to use it for all it was worth. He approached not with a formal challenge, but with the weary air of someone collecting a debt. The border captain sauntered over to Niccolò's horse, his eyes taking in the quality of the merchant's cloak and the number of wagons in his train. He did not ask for papers or purpose. The questions were simpler, more direct. "The road ahead is difficult," the captain said, his voice a low rumble. "Full of dangers. My lord sees to its upkeep and protection. Such safety has a price." Niccolò understood this language perfectly. It was the same as negotiating for a shipment of alum in a crowded foreign port, just with fewer courtesies and more implied threats. He dismounted, meeting the man on his own ground, and offered a smile he did not feel. "Of course," Niccolo replied smoothly. "We are grateful for your lord's diligence. Perhaps a contribution to his efforts would be in order, to show our appreciation." The negotiation was brief, ending with a small but heavy purse of silver changing hands, a toll that was little more than polite extortion. Leaving the captain and his greedy gaze behind, the road offered a different kind of menace. The land grew wilder, the forests darker. 2 days later, the trouble that Leo the Nightjar had supposedly predicted finally found them. It did not come as a crashing ambush from the trees, but as a silent, unnerving presence. First, it was the feeling of being watched, a prickling on the back of the neck that made the guards grip their crossbows tighter. Then, in the twilight, they saw them, shadowy figures melting between the trees at the edge of the firelight. They were not an army, but a dozen or so men, gaunt and hard-faced, armed with long knives and cudgels. They did not attack, they simply waited, their presence a constant, pressing threat on the edges of the camp. That night, no one slept soundly. The guards stood back to back, their faces illuminated by the nervous flicker of the flames. Niccolo sat with his own back against a wagon wheel, a finely made dagger resting on his knee. It felt small and useless. He was a man of numbers and contracts, of weighing risk and reward on a set of brass scales. Here, the calculation was far grimmer. He thought of the cargo hidden in the specially marked crates at the center of the largest wagon, bolts of silk dyed with Elara's impossible blue, and small, heavily sealed chests of saffron worth more than a farmer's entire life of labor. A fight would risk all of it, and the lives of his men besides. Yet, to show weakness might invite ruin, not just now, but for every caravan that followed. As the moon climbed higher, a single figure detached itself from the shadows and walked slowly toward the fire, his hands held open to show he carried no weapon. He was tall and thin, his face all sharp angles and desperation. He stopped just beyond the ring of guards. "We know what you carry, merchant," the man called out, his voice hoarse. "We don't want bloodshed, just a share. The harvest was poor. Our children are hungry." Niccolo looked at the man and wondered if he was a starving peasant or the cunning leader of a seasoned band of robbers. The truth was likely somewhere in between, and it changed nothing. He had to make a choice. His head clerk, a nervous young man named Piero, urged him in a frantic whisper to give the order to attack. "They are few. We have crossbows." But Niccolo saw the dark shapes still lingering in the trees and knew they were likely more than they appeared. He rose to his feet, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He projected a calm he was far from feeling. "Hunger is a harsh master," Niccolo called back to the man, "and we are not without charity. There will be no fight this night. You may take 2 bales of wool and a cask of salt from the rear wagon, a toll for safe passage through your lands." He chose the words carefully, framing the surrender as a transaction, an agreement between men of business. There was a long silence. The leader of the bandits seemed to consider the offer. His eyes narrowed. He glanced back toward the trees, a silent communication passing between him and his unseen comrades. Niccolo held his breath, the cool night air feeling thin in his lungs. The man finally gave a curt nod. "The rear wagon," he repeated, as if sealing the deal. He and two others came forward, and under the watchful eyes of Niccolo's guards, they swiftly unstrapped the bulky bales of raw wool and rolled the heavy salt cask away, disappearing back into the darkness as silently as they had come. They left the most valuable cargo untouched, unaware of the true prize that lay just a few feet away. The rest of the night passed in a state of high alert, but the bandits did not return. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy, the caravan was already moving, the drivers urging the oxen on with a newfound urgency. A profound sense of relief washed over Niccolo, so potent it left him feeling weak. He had lost the profit from the wool and salt, a sum that would have fed a family for a year, but he had protected the core of his investment. It was a costly lesson in the realities of commerce, one that could never be learned from a ledger. Wealth was not just accumulated in cities, it had to survive the journey through a world that was often hungry and hostile. As they traveled on, the landscape slowly began to change. The dense, threatening forests gave way to rolling hills and managed woodlands. And soon they saw the distant sight of cultivated fields. The presence of other people on the road, a farmer with a donkey, a friar walking with a staff, felt like a return to civilization. Each league they covered felt like a line of profit and loss being tallied in Niccolo's mind. He had gambled and won, but the victory felt hollow. He had not defeated his enemy with cleverness or force, but had simply paid them to go away, transforming a violent threat into a business expense. He wondered about Lord Alaric, secure in his stone fortress, his wealth growing from the ground season after season. His risks were floods and blights, things of nature. Niccolo's risks had human faces and carried long knives. He thought of Elara in her workshop, her fortune spun from a secret held in her own mind and hands. Her risk was imitation, a rival stealing her knowledge. His own fortune, he realized with a clarity that the muddy road had given him, was the most fragile of all. It was not bound to the earth or to a unique skill, but to the perilous, unpredictable lines of travel that connected one part of the world to another. The journey was a constant reminder of this fragility. A broken axle on one of the wagons caused a day's delay, the woodsman among his guards working tirelessly to fashion a replacement from a felled oak. Another day, they had to ford a river swollen by recent rains, the water churning brown and cold, threatening to sweep the heavy wagons downstream. Each obstacle was overcome with ingenuity and persistence, but each one chipped away at the profits, adding to the ever-growing list of expenses that existed only on the road. When they finally saw the slate roofs and stone church spire of their destination, a bustling inland town, the sense of accomplishment was immense. The wagons, caked in mud and road-worn, rolled through the town gates to the stares of the locals. Here, Niccolo was no longer a vulnerable traveler, but a prince of commerce once more, the man who brought rare and desirable goods from the world beyond the horizon. In the quiet of the inn that evening, feeling the solid floor beneath his feet, Niccolo could almost forget the weight of the long road, the gnawing tension, and the faces of the hungry men in the woods. The rhythm of a peaceful afternoon in Alaric's domain was broken by the sharp, urgent clatter of a single horse ridden hard into the main bailey. It was not the sound of a returning patrol, which arrived with the weary tread of many animals, but the frantic beat of a message carrier. The rider, caked in the dust of distant roads, slid from a lathered horse whose sides heaved with exhaustion. He carried a leather tube bearing a sigil that every guard on the wall recognized instantly: the crowned falcon of the king. The man's face was a mask of grim purpose, and the way he strode toward the great hall, ignoring offers of water for himself or his beast, sent a ripple of unease through the castle staff. Such haste rarely carried good news. The message itself was a simple thing, a single sheet of stiff parchment. But the weight of the king's seal, a disk of dark red wax, felt immense in Alaric's hand. He broke it with his thumb, the wax crumbling with a faint snap that echoed in the quiet of his solar. The script was formal, the words precise and without warmth. It was a demand, not a request. The king was marching to secure a disputed border territory and required his loyal vassals to provide support. The parchment listed Alaric's obligation plainly: 20 men-at-arms, fully equipped for a summer campaign, and a levy of 500 silver marks to provision the main army. It was a summons that left no room for negotiation, a thinly veiled test of allegiance wrapped in the language of duty. His steward, Martin, a man whose hair had gone gray in service to Alaric's father, read the parchment over his lord's shoulder. Martin's lips thinned as he performed the immediate, silent calculations that were his life's work. 500 marks, he murmured, his voice low. My lord, that will empty the spring coffers entirely. The wool profits have not yet been realized. And 20 men? That is nearly half our household guard. It will leave the northern pastures vulnerable, especially with Lord Valerius pressing his claims on the river crossing. Martin's world was one of numbers and tangible assets, of grain in the storehouse and coin in the chest. To him, this was not about loyalty. It was a catastrophic drain on their resources. This calculation led Alaric from the solar, his mind too restless for the confines of the room. He needed to feel the substance of his domain, the very things this royal command put at risk. He walked alone through the stone corridors, his boots ringing on the flags, a sound that usually brought him comfort, but now seemed hollow. He descended a winding stair into the cool, dark belly of the castle, heading for the armory. Here, the wealth of his house took a different form, not of silver, but of steel and leather and the promise of force. The air itself tasted of metal and smelled of linseed oil used to polish the mail shirts, and the sharp, gritty scent of the grindstones where sword edges were honed to a razor's sharpness. As he stood there, he was not just a lord, but an accountant of war. He ran a hand over the cold, interlocking rings of a hauberk, a long shirt of mail that hung from a wooden frame. Each one represented a man, a family, a small piece of his land's strength. He lifted a heavy helmet, its polished surface reflecting his own grim face. The cost was not just the silver. It was the blacksmith's time to forge new arrowheads, the fletcher's skill to feather the shafts, the food to feed the men on the march, and the horses to carry them. Equipping 20 knights properly meant stripping his own defenses to the bone, leaving his lands exposed and his people feeling unprotected. He was being asked to weaken his own foundations to shore up the king's distant ambitions. His decision required the counsel of those who would have to bleed for it. He sent a page to summon his household knights, the core of his military strength. They gathered in the great hall, their faces serious as they listened to their lord read the king's demand. These were not mere soldiers. They were vassals, men who held smaller parcels of land from him in exchange for their sworn service. Their fortunes were tied to his own. When he finished, a heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the crackle of the hearth fire. Each man was contemplating what it meant to leave his home, his fields, and his family for a war that was not of their making. It was Sir Crackling, his oldest and most trusted vassal, who finally spoke. He was a man with a face like weathered oak, whose loyalty had never been in question. "My lord," he began, his voice respectful but firm, "the king's right to command is absolute. We all know our oaths. But the timing is unfortunate." He gestured vaguely toward the windows that overlooked the fields. "The spring planting is barely done. Taking 20 men now means 20 fewer pairs of hands for the harvest. The silver he asks for is the very coin we had set aside to build the new grist mill by the river, the one that would save our tenants a day's walk to grind their flour." Caelan's words hung in the air, a direct challenge not to Alaric's authority, but to the wisdom of the crown. He was presenting a clear choice, a distant war of honor versus a present need for prosperity. The mill was an investment in their own future, a project that would strengthen Alaric's domain and the lives of the people who lived on it. "A mill feeds our people through the winter," Crackling continued, his gaze steady. "A border war feeds only a king's pride. I will ride with you, my lord, wherever you command, but I ask you to consider what serves us, your people, best." The other knights murmured in agreement, their unease now given a voice. Alaric found himself torn between two sacred duties. On one hand was his sworn oath to the king, an unbreakable bond that formed the very structure of their world. To defy it was to risk being branded a traitor, to invite the wrath of a far greater power down upon them all. It could mean the loss of his lands, his title, everything he held. On the other hand was his unspoken, but no less powerful, duty to his own people, to the men and women who depended on him for protection and justice. Crackling was right. The mill would do more tangible good for them than any victory on a forgotten frontier. He looked at the faces of his men, at Cracklin's earnest plea, and then at the memory of the king's seal on the parchment. His choice was not between right and wrong, but between two different kinds of right. One was the rigid loyalty of a vassal to his lord, the other, the practical duty of a father to his family. To choose his people was to betray his king. To choose his king was to sacrifice the well-being of his people. He felt a deep weariness settle into his bones, the true burden of his wealth and power made painfully clear. It was not a cushion against the world, but a heavier yoke to bear. In the end, the oath had to be honored. "The mill will have to wait," Alaric announced, his voice sounding stronger than he felt. "The king's command must be obeyed. An oath is the foundation upon which all our lands and titles rest. If we choose when and where to honor it, then it is no foundation at all, merely sand." He saw the disappointment in Kalen's eyes, but also the grim acceptance. They were all caught in the same web. "We will send the silver," Alaric continued, "and we will make ready. Tell the men to prepare. We ride in 1 week's time." The knights filed out of the hall, their discussion now turning to the practical matters of armor, horses, and supplies. Alaric remained behind, standing before the great hearth. The decision was made, but the conflict within him remained. He knew this choice would have consequences. The silver was gone. The mill would not be built. To replace the lost coin, he would have to increase the rents on his tenants after the harvest, a move that would turn their loyalty into resentment. The king's war would be fought not only on a distant border, but here, in the strained relations between him and his own people. The structure of fealty, sworn from peasant to knight, knight to lord, and lord to king, had woven itself so completely into their world that a tug from the top sent tremors all the way to the bottom. The rhythmic clatter of the looms was the heartbeat of Ilara's world, a constant, reassuring sound that filled her workshop from dawn until dusk. It was a sound of productivity, of threads becoming cloth, of skill becoming wealth. But on this morning, the heartbeat stuttered and fell silent. One by one, the weavers paused, their hands stilling on the shuttles as a hush spread through the long room. Ilara looked up from the account book, where she was calculating the cost of a new shipment of cochineal insects, the source of her peerless crimsons. The silence was an unnatural thing, and it meant a visitor of great importance had arrived, someone whose presence demanded a halt to the common business of work. Through the open doorway stood the bishop, his purple robes a stark, regal splash of color against the workshop's dusty light and earthy tones. Accompanying the bishop were two stern-faced clerics who seemed to disapprove of the entire scene, their gazes sweeping over the vats of dye and hanging skeins of wool as if cataloging sins. The bishop, however, smiled a serene, practiced smile. He was a man whose softness was deceptive, built upon a foundation of immense power and accustomed to every comfort. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, moved past the apprentices and settled on Ilara. He stepped forward, the scent of expensive church incense, a mix of frankincense and myrrh, clinging to his vestments and momentarily overpowering the workshop's familiar smell of lanolin and boiling madder root. He spoke of the glory of God and the need to beautify his house, his voice smooth and melodic, a sharp contrast to the gruff commands of merchants and guildmasters Ilara usually dealt with. The purpose of his visit was a commission of breathtaking scale. He wanted a series of tapestries for the cathedral, grand enough to cover the cold stone of the entire northern wall of the nave. These were to depict the life of Saint Fiacre, the local patron of healers and gardeners, a story of piety and miracles. As he spoke, Elara felt a flutter of something more than just professional pride. It was a chance to have her work, her name, displayed in the most sacred space in the city. Her silks and dyes, products of commerce and secret knowledge, would be transformed into a testament of faith. It was an opportunity to turn her worldly success, a thing some still viewed with suspicion, into a legacy as solid and enduring as the cathedral stone itself. While the bishop spoke of divine inspiration, his fingers drifted over a bolt of her famous silk, feeling its texture with the unmistakable touch of a connoisseur. The conversation moved to specifics, and the bishop unrolled a preparatory drawing sketched on parchment. It showed the saint healing the sick, his hand raised in blessing, his robes a cascade of folds. "And here," the bishop said, tapping a manicured finger on the saint's cloak, "the blue must be the very color of the heavens at midday, a blue of transcendent purity, to lift the souls of the faithful." Elara's breath caught in her throat. She knew precisely the color he meant, and she knew precisely what it would cost. It was a color derived not from the common woad plant that stained the hands of lesser dyers, but from a rare blue stone, lapis lazuli, mined in distant mountains far to the east. It was a pigment Niccolo de Vieri's traders sometimes brought back, a substance so precious it was sold by the ounce and was often valued more highly than gold. Using such a pigment for a tapestry of this size would be a monumental undertaking. The cost would be immense, enough to consume the profits of an entire year, perhaps more. A cold knot of calculation formed in Elara's stomach, a familiar feeling that always accompanied great risk. She thought of the wages for her 20 apprentices and weavers, the new looms she planned to build, the repairs needed for the workshop's roof. All of it would have to be set aside. This commission would not make her richer in coin. In the short term, it would make her significantly poorer. She watched the bishop's expectant face, saw the unwavering certainty in his eyes. For him, it was a matter of faith and beauty. For her, it was a gamble that could secure her legacy or lead to her ruin. That evening, long after her workers had gone home, Elara walked through the silent workshop. The moonlight coming through the high windows cast long shadows from the silent looms, making them look like great sleeping beasts. She ran her hand over the frame of one, the wood worn smooth by years of use. Her senior apprentice, Lena, had questioned the decision, her brow furrowed with genuine worry. "Mistress, the wool merchants will not wait for payment," she had said softly. "And the winter is long. If we spend everything on the bishop's blue, what will be left for us?" The question lingered, a heavy weight in the quiet room. Elara found herself wrestling with the very purpose of the fortune she had built. Was it for the simple comfort of her own life? Was it for the security of the people who depended on her? Or was it for something more, a grand gesture that might echo for generations? She thought of the great noble families, like Lord Alaric's, whose names were carved into the stones of chapels and whose banners hung in ancient halls. Their legacy was built on land and blood, something she could never have. Her wealth was newer, more fluid, derived from her own mind and hands. Perhaps, she wondered, this was the only way for people like her to achieve a different kind of immortality. By weaving her skill into the fabric of the church, her work would become part of the city's sacred history. People would gaze upon her tapestries 100 years from now and feel a sense of wonder, never knowing her name, but knowing the work of her hands. It was a form of patronage the old nobility had practiced for centuries, a way to cement their place in the social order and, they hoped, in the eyes of God. Her internal struggle was a bitter one. Part of her, the pragmatic merchant who haggled over every coin, recoiled from the sheer extravagance of the expense. It felt like setting fire to a carefully built storehouse of grain. Yet another part, the artist who lived for color and form, was captivated by the challenge. To work with such a rare and vibrant pigment, to create a blue so pure it seemed to hum with its own light, was a temptation almost too powerful to resist. She imagined the threads passing through her fingers, the image slowly emerging from the loom, a piece of heaven made tangible. This project would stretch her skills to their absolute limit and beyond, forcing her to invent new techniques to handle the precious, unforgiving pigment. The decision did not come in a flash of inspiration, but settled upon her slowly, like dust motes in the evening light. She walked to a heavy wooden chest and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in soft linen, was a small, heavy pouch. She untied the leather cord and poured a tiny amount of crystalline blue powder onto a clean slate. It was the last of the lapis lazuli from Niccolo's previous shipment, a sample she had kept for experimentation. Under the moonlight, the grains shimmered with an inner fire, a color so intense it felt alive. It was the color of possibility, of risk, of a legacy that might just outlive stone. She knew then that she had to do it. The financial logic was madness, but the call to create something truly magnificent was stronger. She would have to be clever, of course. She would need to negotiate with Niccolo for his entire future supply, perhaps offering him a stake in a future venture to secure a better price. She would have to manage her workshop with ruthless efficiency, taking on smaller, more profitable commissions for cash while the great work slowly progressed. The strain on her resources would be immense, and her apprentices would have to endure a lean year. They would grumble, and some might even leave, but Lena and the most loyal would understand. They too were artisans, and they would recognize the chance to be part of something that would be spoken of for decades. It was a test not just of her wealth, but of her leadership and their shared craft. This act of patronage was more than a business transaction. It was a delicate dance of power and piety. The bishop was offering her social legitimacy, a way to cleanse her commercial wealth with the holy water of faith. In return, she was offering him a masterpiece that would enhance his own prestige and beautify his cathedral. Both understood the unspoken bargain. It was the way of the world they lived in, where new money constantly sought the validation of old institutions, and those institutions, in turn, were always in need of funds to sustain their earthly grandeur. Her tapestries would be a monument to this symbiotic relationship, a beautiful, woven contract between the sacred and the secular. Ilara carefully swept the precious blue dust back into its pouch, her mind now clear and her purpose set. The risk was enormous, but the potential reward, not in silver, but in permanence, was immeasurable. She would create a blue so profound it would make people forget the world outside the cathedral walls, if only for a moment. Her wealth had given her the freedom to make such a choice, to pursue a goal beyond mere survival or accumulation. It was a heavy burden and a great privilege, and she now understood that the true test of her fortune was not in how much she could gather, but in what she was willing to risk for a chance at eternity. As Ilara put her precious sample away, the distant sound of the watchman's bell, marking the late hour, provided a steady rhythm to the quiet city. The summer never truly arrived that year. Instead of warmth that ripened the wheat to a deep gold, a persistent, chilling rain fell from a sky the color of slate. From the high windows of his solar, Lord Alaric watched the water turn his fields into a sea of mud, beating the stalks of grain into the earth where they would surely rot. A dampness seemed to seep into the very stones of the castle, a cold that no fire on the hearth could fully chase away. He pulled his fur-lined robe tighter around his shoulders, the familiar weight offering little comfort. His own granaries were full, the result of 2 bountiful years and his steward's careful management. They had enough, more than enough, to see his people through the winter and beyond. This foresight, once a source of pride, now felt like a heavy stone in his gut. This feeling grew heavier when the watchman on the gate tower sent word of a group approaching from the east, from the lands of Baron Fitzwalter. They were not soldiers, the man reported, but villagers, walking slowly as if each step required immense effort. Alaric met them in the great hall, the massive oak doors left open to the dreary day. A delegation of a dozen men and women stood before him, their clothes soaked through and clinging to frames that were shockingly thin. Their faces were pale and drawn, with eyes that seemed too large, holding a look of hollowed-out desperation. They did not belong to him, yet they stood on his clean-swept floor, bringing the smell of wet wool and damp earth into his hall, a scent of the suffering that lay just beyond his well-defended walls. Their spokesman, an old man with a straggling white beard, leaned heavily on a staff, his voice a dry rasp. He spoke of fields that had yielded nothing but black mold, of children with bloated bellies, and of a silence that had fallen over their villages as hope ran out. They were not asking for a gift, he explained, but for a chance to buy grain, offering what little they had, a few worn tools, some pewter plates, promises of labor next spring, should they live to see it. Alaric listened, his gaze fixed on a young woman in the back, whose thin arms were wrapped tightly around a silent, motionless bundle. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the rain, that he was looking at the face of famine. He held the power to say yes or no, a power that felt less like a privilege and more like a curse. Later, in the privacy of his solar, the debate was sharp and immediate. His steward, Sir Cailan, a man whose loyalty was matched only by his pragmatism, stood with his back to the fire, his face grim. "My lord, you cannot," he said, his voice low but firm. "Our surplus is our strength. It is what separates us from Fitzwalter. It is our shield against a hard winter, against the king's next levy, against this very sort of chaos. To open the granaries to outsiders is to invite every hungry soul for 50 leagues to our gates. We would be overrun in a fortnight. Your first duty, your only duty, is to the people sworn to you." Cailan's logic was as hard and unyielding as the castle walls, a fortress of reason against a rising tide of need. From her seat near the window, his wife, Lady Isolde, spoke softly, yet her words cut through the steward's arguments. "And what of our Christian duty, Cailan, to feed the hungry? These are not animals at the gate." She turned her gaze to Alaric, her eyes pleading. "Think of the danger as well. Desperate people do not simply starve quietly. A mob of the starving is an unpredictable thing. They might throw themselves against our walls for a crust of bread. A small act of charity now could prevent a great deal of violence later." She posed a question that had no easy answer. Was true security found in hoarding resources, or in the stability that came from preventing the utter despair of one's neighbors? The two arguments tore at him, each one a valid and powerful truth. To resolve the turmoil in his own mind, Alaric left them and climbed the winding stone stairs to the battlements. The wind was stronger up high, whipping his cloak around him and carrying the scent of rain and wet stone. He walked the length of the wall, his boots echoing in the quiet. Below, in the muddy field outside the barbican, the small group of villagers had been joined by others. Families huddled together under makeshift shelters of branches and cloth, their small, smoky fires doing little to ward off the encroaching twilight. The sight was a stark contrast to the orderly, well-fed world within his walls, a world he had spent his life building and protecting. He could hear the faint sound of a baby crying, a thin, weak wail that the wind almost swallowed. That settled the matter. He could not be the lord who sat warm in his castle while children starved at his gate. Cailan's fears were real, as were Isolde's, but the immediate human cost of inaction felt too great to bear. His wealth was meaningless if it only served to build a higher wall between himself and the rest of humanity. It was a risk, a profound one. His peers, other lords who valued strength above all, would call it weakness. His own future security might be compromised. But the alternative, to do nothing, felt like a hollowing out of his own soul, leaving a man with full granaries and an empty heart. Returning to the hall, his decision was made. He would not sell the grain, for they had nothing of value to offer. Nor would he simply open his stores to all comers, as that would surely lead to the ruin Cailan predicted. Instead, he ordered a limited distribution. Each family from Fitzwalter's lands would receive 1 sack of barley, carefully measured, enough to last a week or two, enough to give them a sliver of hope. It was a compromise, an act that would satisfy neither the pragmatist nor the idealist, but it was an action. He watched from a high window as his men, their movements precise and reluctant, carried the sacks out. The response from the crowd below was not loud jubilation, but a quiet, desperate gratitude. Hands reached out, and faces that had been masks of despair softened with a flicker of relief. They took the grain, and by morning they were gone. The field outside his gate was empty again, marked only by the dark circles of their campfires. Alaric felt a measure of peace, but it was a fragile thing. He had alleviated the immediate suffering, but he knew he had not solved the problem. He had merely postponed it, and in doing so had sent a message across the countryside. That evening, the resentment of his peers was not long in coming. A rider arrived from a neighboring estate, carrying a message from its lord, a man known for his harsh rule. The letter was brief, its script sharp and angry. It accused Alaric of encouraging vagrancy and rewarding the incompetence of others, warning that his charity would destabilize the entire region by drawing the desperate away from their own lands and lords. Alaric read the words and tossed the parchment into the fire. He had earned gratitude from the starving and scorn from the powerful. He wondered which would prove more valuable in the difficult days he knew were still to come. The evening's careful measure of barley had left a noticeable dent in his stores, but the castle and its people, for the moment, remained secure. The passing of seasons had etched new lines around Lord Alaric's eyes, each one a testament to harvests gathered and winters endured. The great store of grain from the previous year, which had saved so many, was now a memory, and the new crops stood green and hopeful under a wide sky. It was this future that occupied his thoughts as he rode beside his son, Geoffrey. The rhythmic creak of saddle leather was a familiar comfort, a sound that had accompanied him for decades as he surveyed his domain. Yet this ride felt different. His son, tall and straight in the saddle, paid little attention to the endless fields of barley and wheat that were the source of their family's strength. Instead, his focus remained on the peregrine falcon perched on his gloved fist, a magnificent creature whose restless movements seemed to mirror the boy's own distracted energy. This lack of focus was a constant source of worry for Alaric. He gestured with a broad hand towards a distant section of the estate. "The south field will need to lie fallow next year, Geoffrey. The soil is tired. We'll plant it with clover to restore its heart." His son merely nodded, his eyes tracking the flight of a lark high above. He murmured something about the falcon being ready to be unhooded, using words like jesses and eyas, the special language of a sport that felt increasingly like a distraction. Alaric tightened his grip on the reins, a familiar knot of frustration forming in his gut. He was trying to pass on a lifetime of knowledge, the careful art of husbandry that kept hundreds of families fed. And his heir seemed to hear only the whisper of the wind in a raptor's wings. The future of their name and their people depended on understanding the earth, not the air. As they rounded a bend near a small tenant settlement, a man hurried out to meet them, his head bowed in respect. It was Thomas, a farmer whose family had worked this particular strip of land for generations. He held something out in his calloused hand, his expression a mixture of fear and apology. "My lord," he began, his voice low, "the wheat, it's showing the rust again." Alaric dismounted, his movements heavy with a sense of foreboding. He took the stalk from Thomas and ran his thumb over the head of grain. It came away with a fine, reddish-brown powder that felt gritty against his skin and carried a faint, sickly, metallic smell. Geoffrey remained on his horse, looking down with an air of impatience. "It's a bit of dust, father," he said dismissively. "The rains will wash it away." Alaric's jaw tightened at the boy's foolish words, spoken with the unearned confidence of youth. Ignoring his son's comment, Alaric looked Thomas in the eye, his own gaze sharp with concern. "How far has it spread?" he asked, his voice steady. The farmer pointed toward the center of his largest field, where a patch of wheat seemed to shimmer with an unhealthy, brownish tint under the bright light. "Just that section for now, my lord, but it moves faster than a rumor in a market town." Alaric knew this to be true. He had seen this same creeping sickness turn a promising harvest into a field of worthless straw more than once in his lifetime. This blight, this rust, was not a simple inconvenience. It was a thief that could steal the bread from their mouths before the grain was even cut. He gave Thomas specific instructions for cutting and burning the affected area, a hard but necessary sacrifice to save the rest of the crop, promising him grain from the manor stores to see his family through. The ride back to the castle was a tense and silent affair. The easy rhythm of the horse's walk did little to soothe the storm brewing inside Alaric. Geoffrey, sensing his father's anger, finally put his falcon's hood back on, securing the bird into a state of calm that neither man felt. The sight of his son's careful, practiced movements with the bird's leather straps only sharpened Alaric's ire. The boy could learn the countless intricate rules of falconry, a pastime of leisure, but he could not grasp the fundamental rules of his own life, that their wealth, their title, their very survival grew from the soil. Every fence, every ditch, every fallow field was a line in a story Geoffrey had refused to read. The prosperity Alaric had spent his life building felt suddenly fragile, as brittle as a diseased stalk of wheat. That evening, the confrontation finally came. It happened not in the great hall with its tapestries and audience, but in the quiet of Alaric's solar, where maps of the estate covered a large oak table. Alaric stood over them, his finger tracing the blighted field. When Geoffrey entered, his father did not look up. "You shamed me today," Alaric said, his voice a low rumble. "You shamed yourself. That man, Thomas, knows more about your inheritance than you do. He knows that a bit of dust can mean the difference between a full belly and a hungry winter for his children." Geoffrey bristled, his youthful pride stung. "I am learning the arts of a nobleman, swordplay, heraldry, falconry, not counting stalks of grain like a common steward." The words struck Alaric like a physical blow. He finally looked up from the map, his eyes blazing with a fury that made Geoffrey take an involuntary step back. "The arts of a nobleman?" Alaric's voice rose, echoing off the cold stone walls. "Those arts are built on this." He slammed his hand down on the table, making the parchments jump. "They are paid for by the sweat of men like Thomas. Our name means nothing if the granaries are empty. A title is a hollow word if the people who depend on you starve. I have spent my life ensuring this land provides, that our family is a rock of stability in a world of chaos, and you see it as a thing beneath you." This accusation hung in the air, a truth too sharp to be denied. For a moment, Geoffrey seemed to wilt under his father's anger, but then a different kind of fire lit his own eyes, the fire of resentment. "You care more for this land than for me," he shot back, his voice cracking with an emotion he rarely showed. "It is always the estate, the tenants, the harvest. Have you ever once looked at me and not seen the future Lord Alaric? Have you ever seen just Geoffrey, your son? Everything I do is weighed against what you think your heir should be doing. Perhaps I am not interested in your dirt and your grain, because you have never shown me that there is anything else to you." The accusation struck Alaric with the force of a revelation. He saw in that instant a glimmer of truth in his son's bitter words. He had been so consumed with preserving the legacy that he had failed to connect with the boy who was meant to inherit it. He had tried to teach Geoffrey what to think, but not how to see. He had presented the land as a series of duties and obligations, a heavy burden to be carried, rather than a living thing to be understood and cared for. The tension was no longer about wheat or wealth, but about the vast, silent distance that had grown between a father and his son. The foundation of his entire life's work felt unstable, threatened not by blight or bandits, but by a simple, profound failure of the heart. Alaric slumped into his chair, the anger draining out of him, leaving behind a deep, weary sorrow. The maps on the table suddenly looked like the plans for a tomb, a monument to a future that might never come to pass. He had fought rival lords, negotiated with kings, and survived famine, but he had no strategy for this. How could he protect his people, his family's name, if the next link in the chain was not only unwilling, but felt himself a stranger to the very thing he was meant to command? The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken years of misunderstanding. With the last light fading from the narrow window, Alaric found only a cold disquiet in the familiar maps of the land he had built, and now deeply feared he would lose. The dust of the salt road still seemed to cling to the back of Niccolo di Vieri's throat, a phantom grit he could not wash away. Weeks after his return, the profits from his journey were tallied. The figures scrawled in neat columns by his clerks, filling him with a satisfaction as deep and heavy as the gold coins now locked in his cellars. Yet, as he walked the familiar cobblestones of his home city, he noticed things he had previously ignored. He saw a drayman cursing as his cart's wheel sank into a deep rut near the river, the old wooden bridge groaning under the weight. He watched merchants lose precious time as their goods were ferried across the narrowest point of the water, a slow and costly process. This city had given him his fortune. Perhaps it was time his fortune gave something back to the city. This thought led him not to his counting house, but to the grand hall where the city council met. The room itself was a display of wealth, built by the merchants and guildmasters who now sat within it. Polished oak panels lined the walls, and colored light from high, narrow windows painting shifting patterns on the stone floor. Niccolo felt the smooth, cool wood of the petitioner's bench beneath his hands as he waited his turn to speak. He watched the men who held the city's fate in their hands. The master of the wool guild, his face a mask of stern calculation, and the elderly head of the banking consortium, whose quiet whisper could make or break a man. These were not lords of the land like Alaric, bound by blood and soil. They were men whose power was as fluid as the money that passed through their fingers, a hierarchy of influence built on contracts and reputation. When his name was called, Niccolo rose and walked to the center of the floor. His voice, steady and clear, filled the quiet chamber. He spoke not of a grand new home for himself, nor of a lavish donation to the cathedral that would put his name in gilded letters for all to see. Instead, he proposed something for everyone. "The old bridge sags," he said simply, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. "It is a danger in the wet season and an obstacle to commerce year-round. I propose to fund, from my own purse, the construction of a new bridge. A bridge of stone, wide enough for 2 carts to pass, strong enough to last 100 years. A murmur went through the room, a mix of surprise and appraisal. The proposal was met not with applause, but with a cautious, calculating silence. It was broken by Lorenzo Bellini, the head of a rival trading family, whose ships vied with Niccolo's for dominance in the spice markets. Lorenzo rose slowly, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. "A generous offer," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "A truly noble gesture. But our city has always built its own monuments. We are not so poor that we must rely on the charity of one man. Is this a gift, Master Vieri, or is it a chain?" The accusation hung in the chamber, unspoken but clear. They saw his proposal not as a gift to the city, but a calculated move, a way to place them all in his debt and secure his own trade routes. Niccolo felt a familiar tension tighten his shoulders, the same feeling he'd had when facing the border captain on the salt road. This was another kind of negotiation, just as dangerous. He did not look at Lorenzo, but instead turned his attention to others in the room. His eyes found Master Giulio, the powerful head of the stonemasons' guild, a man whose hands were thick with the memory of hard labor. "Master Giulio," Niccolo said, his tone respectful, "think of the work. For your masons, your quarrymen, your laborers. 2 years of steady employment, paid for. The finest stone from the northern hills, shaped by the best hands in the Republic." He saw a flicker of interest in Giulio's stern face. This was not about charity. It was about shared prosperity. He then shifted his gaze to the merchants who dealt in timber and inland goods, men whose livelihoods depended on the slow, unreliable wagons that crossed the river. And for you, he continued, imagine the time saved. No more waiting for ferries, no more loads lost to a collapsed plank. Your goods will flow into our markets twice as fast. He could see them doing the calculations in their heads, weighing the cost of their pride against the promise of greater profit. He was not asking for their gratitude, he was appealing to their reason. It was a language every man in that room understood far better than poetry or prayers. This was a battle, he realized, as surely as any fought with swords. But the weapons were words, influence, and the cold logic of coin. The debate that followed was heated, a complex dance of alliances and old resentments. Lorenzo Bellini's faction spoke of civic pride and the danger of giving one man too much influence. They argued that the council should raise a tax, that the bridge should be a collective effort, a monument to the Republic, not to a single merchant. But Niccolo had planted his seeds carefully. The stonemason, Giulio, spoke in favor of the project, his gruff voice carrying the weight of all the city's craftsmen. He spoke of the honor of the work, but his true message was about the wages that would feed their families. Other merchants, swayed by the practical benefits, added their support. Niccolo remained silent, letting the currents of their own self-interest carry his proposal forward. He had learned on his travels that a direct assault was often foolish. The wiser path was to understand what each person wanted, and to show them how helping you would help themselves. He watched as a man who owed him a favor from a past shipping venture spoke of the city's future. He saw another, with whom he had a quiet partnership in the silk trade, argued for the importance of progress. He had spent years building not just a fortune, but a web of small obligations and shared interests. Now, in this hall, he was pulling gently on those threads. The final vote was close, but it fell in his favor. Permission was granted. Later that evening, long after the council hall had emptied, Niccolo stood on the muddy bank of the river. The old wooden bridge, dark and skeletal against the twilight sky, creaked with every gust of wind. It was ugly, unsafe, and inefficient, a problem he now had the power to solve. He could already imagine the clean, strong arches of stone rising in its place, a permanent mark on the city that would outlast him, his ships, and all his gold. It was more than a trade route. It was a statement. A man's wealth, he considered, was not only what he could keep, but what he could build with it. He thought of Lord Alaric in his distant stone castle, his power tied to the land and the people who worked it. Here in the city, power was different. It was something to be won and re-won every day in halls like the one he had just left. It was a game of persuasion and shared benefit, of knowing when to be generous and when to remind someone of a past debt. The web of loyalties and rivalries that held the city together felt both as ancient as its founding families and as shifting as the river flowing before him. The first sign of trouble appeared on a market day, not as a shouted warning, but as a splash of color on a common merchant's stall. Ilara was inspecting a shipment of raw alum, a mineral vital for fixing her dyes, when her eye caught a bolt of silk displayed nearby. It was a watery, uncertain blue, a pale ghost of the deep, vibrant shade that had made her workshop the most sought after in the city. A cold knot formed in her stomach as she walked closer, her fingers tracing the weave. The work was clumsy, the thread inconsistent, but the underlying tone was unmistakable. It was her blue, or a clumsy attempt at it, sold for 1/3 of the price she commanded. The merchant, noticing her interest, cheerfully remarked on the bargain, unaware he was speaking to the very person whose life's work he was selling as a cheap imitation. This unsettling discovery led her to purchase a length of the offensive cloth, carrying it back to her workshop with a sense of dread. Under the steady light from the high windows, where the truth of a color could not hide, her fears were confirmed. She unraveled a single thread and held it beside one of her own. The forgery was plain to see. Yet, when she burned a small swatch, the scent that rose, a unique combination of her specific herbal infusions and mineral salts, was an undeniable signature. Someone had stolen not just her color, but the very soul of her process. This was not mere competition. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial loss, for her methods were a secret she guarded more closely than her coin. The trail of whispers was short and easy to follow in a city where every guild member's business was common gossip. The new workshop was funded by a consortium of goldsmiths, men who had long resented the Weavers' Guild for its growing influence. And at its heart was Leo, her most promising apprentice, a young man with clever hands and ambition that had clearly curdled into theft. He had left her service 2 months prior, claiming a desire to care for his ailing mother in the countryside. Ilara now pictured him not at a bedside, but hunched over a dye pot, clumsily replicating the steps she had so carefully taught him, his pockets lined with the silver of her rivals. The thought left a bitter taste in her mouth, like chewing on iron shavings. With the backing of another powerful guild, a legal challenge felt almost hopeless. She had heard the stories of others who had sought justice in the guild courts. Cases would drag on for years, with fortunes spent on advocates and finely worded petitions, only for the final judgment to be swayed by a discreet gift to the right master craftsman on the council. The process was designed not for justice, but to preserve the existing balance of power, and she was an unwelcome disruption to that balance. She imagined herself standing before a panel of stern-faced men, her claims dismissed with a condescending smile, while Leo and his patrons grew rich from her stolen knowledge. A part of her recoiled from the inevitable humiliation and expense of such a fight. Rejecting this path of public dispute, Ilara found her resolve hardening into a different shape. She returned to her workshop that evening, not in defeat, but with a cold fury that focused her mind. She dismissed her remaining apprentices for the week, telling them she needed to conduct inventory, a thin excuse they were wise enough not to question. Then she barred the heavy oak door from the inside. The rhythmic clatter of the looms fell silent, and the familiar, bustling space became a sealed chamber, a fortress for her last stand. The familiar smells of dried madder root and stored wool, usually a comfort, now seemed to call her to action. She was not just a weaver, she was the keeper of mysteries, and one had been breached. Her first act was one of creative destruction. She gathered her ledgers, the precious books filled with years of meticulous notes on dye mixtures, temperatures, and timing, and carried them to the hearth. Page by page, she fed her life's work to the flames. The smoke that billowed up the chimney carried with it the secret of her famous blue, and it made her eyes water with something more than irritation. It was a terrifying act of liberation. As the last page purled into black ash, she felt a profound sense of loss, but also a sliver of hope. Leo could replicate the past, but he did not possess the mind that had created it. Her knowledge was not on the pages, but behind her eyes and in the instincts of her hands. With the past reduced to embers, she began to experiment. For days that blurred into one another, she worked relentlessly, surrounded by bubbling pots and the sharp, acidic scent of vinegar mordants. She tried combinations she had long dismissed as impractical or too expensive. She crushed minerals with her pestle until her arms ached, mixed them with strange herbs from Niccolo's far-off supply lines, and dipped countless silk threads into the heated liquids. Most attempts were failures. The threads emerged in disappointing shades of mud brown or a sickly pale yellow. The floor became littered with discarded, discolored skeins, monuments to her frustration. Her hands, perpetually stained, looked as if she had dipped them in a painter's messy palette. Sleep became a brief interruption, taken on a small cot in the corner of the workshop. Her dreams a chaotic swirl of colors that refused to settle. Once, an apprentice knocked timidly, leaving a small loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese by the door, a silent offering of support. She ate without tasting it, her mind consumed by the problem before her. She found herself torn, wondering if this quest was born of pride. Was it wiser to accept the loss and simply continue, a lesser artist than she had been? Yet, the thought of Leo's smug success and the condescending smiles of the goldsmiths always drove her back to the dye pots, stoking the fires of her defiance. The breakthrough came not from a logical progression, but from a half-forgotten memory. Years ago, a trader working for Niccolo had brought her a small sealed pouch as a curiosity from the distant, sun-scorched lands of the New World. It contained the dried bodies of tiny insects that, when crushed, produced a brilliant red powder. At the time, she had deemed it too rare and costly for practical use, a mere novelty. Now, driven by desperation, she retrieved the pouch from a locked chest. Its contents seemed to weigh more than gold. The crushed insects looked like little more than red dust, but she felt a tremor of possibility. With painstaking care, she deviated from every known dyeing tradition. Instead of using common alum or iron to fix the color, she mixed the precious insect powder with a precise measure of refined tin, dissolved in a solution of sharp vinegar. The mixture hissed and bubbled, releasing a strange, almost metallic odor. Holding her breath, she submerged a single perfect strand of white silk into the roiling crimson liquid. She counted to 100, her heart pounding in time with the numbers, before carefully lifting the thread from the pot with a pair of wooden tongs. She raised it into a beam of light slanting through the window. It was not merely red. It was a color she had never seen before, a deep, luminous crimson that seemed to drink the light and radiated back with an inner fire. It shifted from ruby to garnet as she turned it in her hands, a living, breathing shade of impossible richness. It made her famous blue look like a pale winter sky. This was not a defense of her old work. It was a complete reinvention. This color was hers alone, born of desperation, and sealed by a secret no one else in the world could even guess at. In that moment, the threat posed by Leo and his stolen formula seemed to fade into insignificance. She worked through the night to replicate the result, her movements now sure and certain. When the first light of dawn touched the city, she unbarred the workshop door. The air outside felt cool on her flushed skin. The apprentices, who had been waiting with anxious faces, fell silent as she emerged. She said nothing, but simply held up a skein of the new crimson silk. In the morning light, it shimmered with a depth that made them all gasp. In the growing light of the new day, she carried the weight of her triumphant secret back into the world, ready to begin again. The familiar rhythm of Niccolo di Vieri's world was the sound of prosperity itself. From the high window of his counting house, he could hear the rumble of wine barrels rolling over the city's cobblestones, the sharp calls of gulls fighting over discarded fish, and the overlapping shouts of sailors in a dozen different tongues. These sounds were the lifeblood of his fortune, a constant and reassuring music that spoke of goods arriving and coin changing hands. The air that drifted through the open shutters carried the sense of his trade, the dusty sweetness of cinnamon from one warehouse, the sharp tang of salt and tar from the docks, and the earthy smell of raw wool from another. Every element of the bustling port was a testament to a world in motion, a world he understood and, in many ways, controlled. This established rhythm was first disrupted not by a storm or a pirate raid, but by the quiet, almost shamefaced arrival of a single cog from Kaffa, a trading post on the distant shores of the Black Sea. It did not sail into the harbor with the proud, full sails of a successful voyage. Instead, it limped toward the quay, its canvas torn and its wooden hull streaked with grime, moved only by a handful of exhausted men. There was no triumphant ringing of the port bell to announce its cargo. The ship simply tied up at a remote pier, and the few sailors who could still walk stumbled onto the land, their faces hollowed and their eyes wide with a fear that seemed out of place in the bright afternoon. The stories they told in the dockside taverns that evening were disjointed and strange, whispered over cups of watered-down wine. They spoke not of profits or exotic goods, but of a sickness that had swept through their port of call like a phantom scythe. It began, they said, with a burning fever and dark swellings in the groin and armpits. The afflicted would then cough up blood, and within a few days they were gone. The harbor masters and merchants who gathered to listen mostly shook their heads. Shipboard fevers were common, a known risk of long voyages in cramped quarters. The tales were dismissed as the exaggerated ramblings of a crew that had suffered an unfortunate but ordinary outbreak of disease. Niccolo himself heard these rumors from one of his clerks and gave them little thought. His mind was occupied by more immediate concerns. A delayed shipment of silk from Lucca was costing him money with each passing day, and a rival family was attempting to corner the market on alum, a mineral vital for fixing dyes. The fantastical stories of a few sick sailors from a far-flung outpost were a distraction from the real, tangible business of making and protecting his wealth. He had built his entire enterprise on managing concrete risks: storms at sea, bandits on land, the shifting allegiances of princes. A ghost story was not a factor in his careful calculations. However, the ghost story refused to fade. A week later, another vessel arrived, this one a galley fleeing the port of Messina in Sicily. Its crew, or what was left of it, told an almost identical tale. They described a city gripped by panic, where people fell ill in the streets, and families sealed themselves in their homes. This was no longer a distant whisper from the edge of the known world. Messina was a major crossroads of trade, a vital link in the chain that brought wealth from the east to the west. The nervous glances exchanged between dock workers became more frequent, and the usual boisterous laughter in the taverns was replaced by a more subdued and anxious murmur. Soon, the sickness was no longer a story, but a disruptive force in commerce. Letters began to arrive from Niccolo's agents across the sea, their elegant script filled with an uncharacteristic urgency. An agent in Genoa wrote that the city council had ordered a 40-day quarantine on all ships arriving from the Levant. Another in Venice described how the great port was turning away any vessel with even a single sick man aboard. Trade routes that had been reliable for a century began to seize up. The intricate web of supply and demand, the very system that made men like Niccolo powerful, was starting to fray, not from war or economic collapse, but from fear. Niccolo began to feel the change in the port's very breathing. The constant reassuring noise of commerce was softening. He noticed that from his window he could now clearly hear the gentle lapping of water against the stone quays, a sound that was normally lost beneath the din of work. Fewer ships meant fewer barrels to roll, fewer crates to haul, and fewer sailors to shout. The vibrant pulse of his city was slowing, and with it, the flow of gold into his coffers. The change was subtle at first, but for a man whose senses were attuned to the rhythms of trade, it was as alarming as a sudden silence in the middle of a battle. The decisive moment came with the arrival of a fast courier ship carrying a single sealed letter from his most trusted factor in Constantinople. The man, a sober and unflappable merchant named Paolo, did not write of market prices or shipping schedules. His script was hurried, the ink smudged in places. He described watching the pestilence consume entire districts of the great city. He wrote of carts piled high with the dead and an odor of decay that clung to the sea mist. The letter ended with a desperate plea. "Master Niccolo, for the love of God, halt all your ships from the east. Accept no cargo, no matter the profit. Burn this letter after you have read it. This is not a sickness of the sea. It is the end of the world." That evening, Niccolo stood alone in his counting house, the source of his power. The shelves were filled with heavy ledgers, each line a record of a successful venture, a testament to his acumen. Paolo's letter lay on the polished oak desk, its stark warning a direct challenge to everything these books represented. To follow its advice meant financial ruin. He had 3 galleys laden with spices and silks due to arrive within the month, their holds filled with goods already paid for with his silver. To turn them away would be to throw a fortune into the sea. It would mean breaking contracts with powerful men and destroying a reputation for reliability that had taken him a lifetime to build. He walked the length of his private office, the scent of beeswax from the polished floorboards a familiar comfort in his turmoil. He remembered facing down bandits on the Salt Road years ago, a visible threat that could be negotiated with or fought. This was entirely different. It was an invisible enemy, a rumor carried on the wind. To act on such a thing felt like giving in to baseless panic, the kind of emotional decision he despised in other men. Yet to ignore the consistent, terrified warnings from his most reliable sources felt like an act of profound foolishness. His father's voice echoed in his memory, a piece of advice given long ago. A wise merchant is not one who never loses, but one who knows which losses he must accept. He made his decision with the cold finality of a man signing away his own legacy. He summoned his senior clerk and his harbor master, their faces etched with confusion in the flickering lamplight. Calmly, Niccolo dictated his orders. His private docks were to be closed. Any of his ships arriving from the east were to be denied entry and ordered to anchor at a deserted island 2 leagues down the coast to wait out their quarantine. He then instructed the clerk to draft letters to his trading partners, declaring all current contracts void due to circumstances beyond his control. Each word he spoke was like a drop of blood, a small but vital part of the wealth he was deliberately draining away. His rivals in the city's merchant guilds were quick to react. At first, they were incredulous, then openly scornful. They saw his actions as a complete loss of nerve, a surrender to superstitious fear. As Niccolo's docks fell silent, theirs became busier, snapping up the trade he had abandoned. They called him Niccolo the Cautious behind his back, a name meant to mock his prudence as weakness. From his high window, he watched one of their ships unload a cargo of pepper from Alexandria, the dock workers moving with their usual speed, their voices carrying clearly across the water. A sharp pang of doubt struck him. Perhaps he had made a ruinous error, sacrificing a real fortune to fight a phantom. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the now quiet harbor, Niccolo stood on the stone balcony outside his office. The air was cool, carrying only the clean scent of the sea. The sounds of the city were muted, as if holding their breath. He had built a fortress of caution around his assets, but a fortress without supply lines is a tomb. The wealth recorded in his ledgers was now just ink on paper, a frozen asset in a world that seemed to be grinding to a halt. He felt less like a merchant prince and more like a gambler who had pushed all his chips onto a single uncertain bet. Niccolo turned from the view and returned to his study. Tomorrow would reveal whether his choice had saved him or merely hastened his ruin. Summary. This chapter details the arrival of the Black Death in Europe as a series of confusing and terrifying rumors, forcing the merchant Niccolo to make a financially devastating decision to quarantine his ships and warehouses based on uncertain information, placing his fortune at immense risk. End state. Niccolo has chosen to prioritize survival over profit, isolating his business operations from the incoming plague, a decision that has earned him the mockery of his rivals and left his vast wealth in a precarious, frozen state. The first whispers of the sickness arrived with a lone shepherd who stumbled back from the southern hills. His tale a fevered mix of an entire village silenced by a cough and a strange dark swelling. Lord Alaric, in his great hall, listened to his steward's report and dismissed it. Sickness was a constant companion in the damp winters, a shadow that thinned the weakest from the flock. His stone walls were high, his granaries full, and his domain was an island of order in a shifting world. He sent a small purse of silver to the village priest for prayers and thought little more of it, turning his attention back to the tallies of wool and timber, the solid, tangible pillars of his life. But then 2 more villages went quiet, and the reports that trickled back were no longer of common fevers, but of a swift and merciless reaping that left homes empty overnight. This silence, once distant, soon crept closer, its tendrils reaching under the portcullis of Alaric's formidable castle. The thick oak doors and stone battlements, built to repel armies, offered no defense against an enemy that traveled on a breath or a touch. A kitchen maid was the first to fall, her sudden fever and delirium causing a ripple of unease through the servant quarters. Then one of the guards from the western tower collapsed at his post, his strong frame overcome in less than a day. Alaric walked the familiar corridors of his home, but the tapestries seemed to hold new, darker shadows, and the cold drafts that snaked along the floor felt like a chilling premonition. The bustle of daily life slowed, replaced by fearful glances and a strange quiet in the courtyards where children once played. His world, once a fortress of certainty, was becoming a cage of fear. With the fear came the stark realization of his own powerlessness. Alaric's wealth, a force that could command knights and build bridges, was utterly useless against this creeping dread. He sent riders with bags of silver to the nearest city, promising a fortune to any physician who would come. An old man in dark robes eventually arrived, his face hidden behind a beaked mask filled with pungent herbs, a strange bird of ill omen. He burned foul-smelling concoctions in the sick rooms and bled the afflicted with his polished knives. But his expensive efforts only seemed to hasten the end. Alaric's vast stores of grain, the bedrock of his fortune, sat untouched. The millers were too sick to grind the flour, and the baker's ovens were cold. His silver could not buy a cure, and his food could not be eaten without healthy hands to prepare it. The invisible scythe that swept through the villages and servant halls did not respect station or title. It found its way to the Lord's own chambers, to the heir he had so carefully, if impatiently, tried to shape. Geoffrey, his son, complained one evening of a deep chill that no fire could warm. By morning, a violent fever had taken hold. Alaric sat by his son's bed, a position he had rarely taken, feeling a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He watched the boy who had once recited poetry and galloped across the fields with his falcons now struggle for each ragged breath. The physician's herbs only made the air sharp and bitter, doing nothing to quell the tremors that shook Geoffrey's body. All the land, all the titles, all the carefully guarded legacy felt like a bitter mockery as he watched his own bloodline failing before his eyes. The end came on the third day. Geoffrey's passing was not a noble, quiet affair, but a final, desperate gasp in a room that smelled of sickness and failure. With that last breath, the future Alaric had spent a lifetime securing simply vanished. The continuity of his name, the passing of the estate from father to son for generations, was broken. The bitter arguments they had shared, the boy's disinterest in the land, now seemed like trivial matters from another lifetime. Alaric stood over the still form of his son and felt the immense weight of his lordship collapse into the singular, crushing grief of a father. He was no longer a great lord managing a crisis. He was just a man who had lost his child, his heir, and his purpose all at once. This profound loss rippled outward, weakening the very foundations of his authority. The surviving tenants, gaunt and hardened by what they had witnessed, saw the Lord's grief and the thinning of his household guards. They saw their own value differently now, for a field is worthless without a farmer to plow it. A small group of men who would have once approached his hall with their heads bowed low, came to the main gate. Their spokesman, a tenant farmer named Thomas, did not beg for relief. He stated their terms. They would no longer be bound to the land by the old oaths. They wanted their freedom, fair wages for their labor, and an end to the endless duties owed to a lord who could no longer protect them from even an unseen foe. Alaric faced them in the great hall, the empty spaces echoing with the ghosts of his former power. His steward, a man of the old ways, advised him to make an example of them, to use force to remind them of their place. But Alaric looked at the determined faces of the dozen men before him, and then looked past them, picturing the hundreds who were gone. There were not enough guards to enforce his will, not enough healthy men to work the fields if these few were punished. The entire structure that gave his title meaning had crumbled. He was a king with no subjects, a general with no army. With a voice that felt hollow in his own ears, he agreed to their terms, an act that felt less like a negotiation and more like a surrender to a new and terrifying world. After they left, he walked out from his castle and through a nearby village. The silence was absolute. Where the sounds of children, chickens, and the blacksmith's hammer should have been, there was nothing. Doors to empty cottages swung on creaking hinges, revealing cold hearths and abandoned belongings. The small herb gardens were overgrown with weeds, and the sharp scent of rosemary planted to ward off the sickness mixed with the faint, sweet odor of decay that clung to the lanes. He saw a doll made of rags lying in the mud, dropped by a child who would never return to claim it. He had always seen this land as a collection of assets, fields producing grain, forests yielding timber, people providing labor. Now he saw it for what it truly was, a community of souls, and it was gone. Returning to his castle as dusk settled, the great stone keep felt less like a fortress and more like a mausoleum. It was a monument to a power that no longer existed. He was the lord of empty fields and silent villages. His wealth was a hoard of useless metal in a locked room. His legacy was a fresh grave on the hillside, and his title was an empty word. He was no longer Lord Alaric, master of his domain. He was simply a man, standing alone in the ruins of his world, listening to the profound and unsettling quiet. Around the cold stone walls of his hollowed-out keep, the familiar sounds of a living world had ceased, replaced by the whisper of the wind through empty lanes. A year had passed since the great silence fell. Lord Alaric walked a path that was once a road, now just a faint trace through fields of defiant weeds and wildflowers. He stooped, his back protesting with a familiar ache, and pulled a stubborn thistle from the earth, its roots clinging to the soil that was supposed to be his. The land remained, vast and indifferent, stretching to the wooded hills on the horizon, but its meaning had been hollowed out. He remembered standing in his great hall, listening to stewards recite endless lists of grain measures, livestock counts, and timber yields. He had believed those numbers were the foundation of his power, the bedrock of his family's name. Now he understood they were merely symbols for the one thing that truly mattered, the people who worked the land. The wealth had never been in the dirt itself, but in the hands that tilled it. Because of this profound loss, his days had taken on a new, quiet rhythm. In the distance, he could see a small group of men, perhaps 5 in all, scything a patch of hay. They were tenants from 3 different families, working together because no single family had enough able-bodied men left to bring in a harvest alone. They had come to him not with petitions, but with demands, for lower rents, for the right to pasture their animals on his private meadows, for the freedom to leave. He had agreed to it all. What choice was there? His authority had vanished with the population that had once upheld it. His son, Joffrey, who had seen these people as mere instruments, was gone. Alaric was left with the land, an empty title, and the agonizing clarity that he had been the caretaker of a garden, not the master of a kingdom, and he had failed to protect the gardeners.
Meanwhile, many leagues away in the bustling port city, the sounds were returning, though they were different now. Niccolo di Vieri stood on the docks, a place he had once commanded with an easy confidence. The familiar cries of gulls still echoed overhead, but the chorus of human voices was thinner, the languages spoken fewer. A single large cog was being unloaded, its goods from the Levant more precious than ever before. Spices that had once been commodities were now treasures, and the men who handled the crates moved with a deliberate, almost reverent care. Niccolo felt a chill despite the warmth of the day, a sensation that had little to do with the sea breeze. He had survived, his decision to quarantine his ships and warehouses having saved his fortune and his life, but the experience had shattered his belief in his own control. He had always viewed the world as a great ledger, a series of risks and rewards to be calculated. He had mastered its rules, learning to navigate the tempers of foreign princes and the treachery of the sea with equal skill. Yet the pestilence had not been a rival to be outmaneuvered or a storm to be weathered. It was an indifferent tide that had swept away the patterns of the world, erasing ledgers and sinking fleets without a sound. His wealth, he now saw, was a delicate web of connections stretching across the known world, and that web had been torn to shreds. Though he was now wealthier than ever in this emptier world, the gold felt cold in his coffers. It was a monument to his luck, not his genius, and he knew with a certainty that chilled his soul how easily it could all be taken away again. This new, fragile trade brought unexpected opportunities for some. In her workshop, where the rhythmic clatter of looms had once filled the space, there was now only the sound of a single shuttle moving back and forth. Ilara sat before her masterpiece, her hands moving with an old, ingrained grace. The commission was from a new bishop, a man who had risen to his position over the bodies of a dozen more senior clerics. He wanted new tapestries for the cathedral, robes for his investiture, all in the shimmering crimson she had created in a fit of desperate innovation. The demand for her work was immense. With so few master artisans left, her skills were worth more than a minor lord's estate. She had apprentices again, 2 young girls with solemn eyes who learned her techniques with a hungry intensity, knowing the value of a craft that could not be wiped out by disease.
Yet, there was no triumph in her success. Every time she looked at the vibrant thread, she remembered the faces of the apprentices she had lost. She recalled her moral struggle over the cost of the bishop's first commission, the one for the celestial blue tapestry. She had worried about her profits, about her standing, about her legacy. Such concerns felt like the vanities of a forgotten age. What was a legacy of piety when the graveyards were overflowing? Her wealth had proven more resilient than Alaric's or even Niccolo's, for it resided not in land or in ships, but within her own mind and hands. But this realization brought no comfort. It only highlighted the terrible randomness of it all, leaving her with a profound and unshakable sense of guilt for having survived when so many others had not. The new world taking shape was one of stark contrasts. In Alaric's domain, a tenant who had survived now farmed a strip of land that had once belonged to 3 different families. He was poorer in community, but richer in opportunity. His labor suddenly a rare and valuable thing. He no longer bowed his head when Alaric passed. He gave a simple nod, the greeting of one man to another, not of a peasant to his lord. The rigid structures that had defined life for centuries had crumbled into dust.
and in their place, something new and uncertain was growing. People were remaking their lives not according to ancient obligations, but according to immediate practical needs, forging a world that their parents would not have recognized. Across the continent, Niccolo saw a similar shift on his docks. Sailors, once a desperate and expendable class of men, now demanded wages that would have been unthinkable just 2 years prior. A skilled captain could name his price, for ships were plentiful, but experienced crews were not. This forced Niccolo to change his entire approach to business. He had to offer shares in the profits and treat his employees not as servants, but as partners. His fortune was still immense, but his power over others had diminished. He had to negotiate, persuade, and bargain for things he had once simply commanded. The world of commerce, like the world of the manor, was being rebuilt on different terms, forged in the crucible of immense and shared loss. Ilara, too, felt this change in the very fibers of her work. Her new apprentices did not come from families with long weaving traditions. They were orphans, children of merchants and bakers who saw in her workshop not the continuation of a craft, but a simple chance at survival. They worked with a quiet desperation, learning the secrets of her dyes without the joy and camaraderie she remembered from her own youth. She was no longer just a master weaver passing down a tradition. She was a lifeline. Her workshop was not merely a place of business, but a sanctuary against the lingering fear that haunted the city's quieted streets. This new responsibility felt heavier than any commission she had ever undertaken. In his quiet, overgrown fields, Alaric often found himself thinking of the stone bridge Niccolo had proposed to build. He had heard of the project from a traveling friar before the sickness came. At the time, he had dismissed it as the ambition of a merchant, a man trying to buy the permanence that came naturally to a landed lord. Now he saw it differently. He understood the desire to build something that would outlast a single lifetime, something that would serve people you would never know. His own legacy, he feared, was written in the scattered boundary stones of abandoned fields and the fading memories of a world that was gone forever. What did it matter that his family had held these lands for 200 years? The plague had erased that history in 2 seasons. Niccolo, for his part, had revived the bridge project. The city council, decimated and desperate for signs of recovery, had approved it without debate. The work had begun, and the sound of stonemasons' hammers chipping away at granite blocks was one of the few signs of genuine creation in a city preoccupied with recovery. He would visit the site, watching the structure slowly take shape, a solid, unshakable thing in a world that had proven to be as fragile as glass. He poured his profits into it, finding more satisfaction in the rising arches of the bridge than in the mounting piles of silver in his counting house. It was an act of penance, an offering to a future he could not control but desperately wanted to believe in.
The lives of these 3 individuals, once so different, had been woven together by a shared reckoning. Alaric, the Lord of the Earth, Niccolo, the Prince of the Sea, and Ilara, the Master of the Loom, had all learned the same lesson. Their wealth, whether measured in acres, ducats, or skeins of silk, was a temporary thing, dependent on a fragile order they had all taken for granted. In this quieter, emptier world, they were left to contemplate what truly endured. It was not gold, nor land, nor title. Perhaps, they each considered in their own way, it was the skill of a hand, the strength of a stone arch, or the simple, stubborn resilience of the few who were left to begin again. The cool smoothness of the crimson thread beneath Ilara's fingers was a constant reminder of all that was lost and all that was yet to be made. This chapter explores the philosophical and existential reckoning of the three main characters, Lord Alaric, the merchant Niccolo, and the weaver Ilara, a year after the Black Death, showing how their understanding of wealth, power, and legacy has been irrevocably altered by the societal collapse and their personal losses. In the aftermath of the plague, the old social and economic orders have shattered, forcing the surviving characters to rebuild their lives and fortunes on entirely new terms. With Alaric's land-based power broken, Niccolo's trade-based wealth humbled, and Ilara's skill-based success tempered by immense personal loss and a heavy sense of responsibility. As our exploration of medieval wealth concludes for the night, imagine the great hall of our magnate. The final logs on the fire collapse into a gentle orange glow, their light softening the shadows on the great tapestries. The day's accounts are settled, the castle guard is set, and the stone walls now hold a deep and profound quiet. All the power and influence we spoke of, the vast lands, the chests of coin, the political favor, has been put to rest, just as the day has. Now, let this peaceful scene guide you into your own rest. Allow the concerns of your world to fade like those distant echoes in a stone keep. May your sleep be as secure as a fortress chamber, and your dreams as tranquil as the still midnight air over a silent kingdom. Let the weight of the day lift and drift into a deep and restorative peace. Good night.